Thank you, Peter. Lovely to be here. My name is Rafe. I identify as binary. My pronouns are 0101. But it is lovely to see everyone here and to be amongst kindred spirits on St. George's Day. It's a lovely atmosphere around here, I have to say, today. I only have one St. George's Day joke. That'll be my last one for today. An Englishman, an Irishman, and a Scotsman are in a pub on the 23rd of April, having a drink. The Englishman says, "My son's coming in later, it's his birthday. He was born on St. George's Day, so we called him George." And the Scotsman says, "Oh, what a coincidence," he says. "My son was born on St. Andrew's Day. We called him Andrew." And the Irishman says, "Oh, to be sure, fancy that. It's the same with my son, Pancake." Now, of course, Irish jokes aren't allowed anymore, but there is a connection because for the last 200 years, up until fairly recently, the Irish were the biggest immigrant community in the UK, but times change and Britain has changed. Indeed, over the past 25 years, since the election of New Labour in '97, Britain's undergone a profound demographic shift that has fundamentally changed the character of towns and cities across the kingdom. The fabric of many of these communities has been altered to such an extent that they're often unrecognizable to the generations that once called them home. From the old mill towns of the north to the heart of our capital city, this demographic change has created parallel societies of segregated populations whose daily lives pass with little or no interaction with wider society. Now, this situation is quite without precedent in our Long Island story. So how did it come to be? Well, it was infamously revealed by former Labour speechwriter Andrew Neither that a deliberate policy of the Blair administration had been to open up the UK to mass immigration. And he should know because he was the chief speechwriter for the immigration minister who delivered the landmark speech in 2001. And he said that the Labour Party's agenda was in part to rub the right's nose in diversity and render their arguments out of date. Now, as ethnic minorities tend to vote 80% towards the Labour Party, there was also clear selfish gain in this policy. Mass immigration was going to ensure that in decades to come, the Labour Party would have a vast tranche of votes that were off limits to the Tory Party. And certainly, as we can see now in modern-day London and in the cities of the north, it's a policy that is proving successful. But as I'm on limited time, I want to focus exclusively on the core issues, or the issues that I think are at the coalface of the issues of segregation and multiculturalism and mass immigration, and that is the segregated communities of the north of England, primarily those of the Pakistani and Bangladeshi communities, because those are the ones that are the most segregated of all, with about 90% of the population of parts of Bradford and Burnley and Birmingham and Blackburn exclusively Pakistani, Bangladeshi. But of course, they aren't the only communities to suffer from poor integration and assimilation. Now, some of you may be familiar with the Pew Institute, which is a very respected, non-partisan polling organization in America. And they have released polling showing that British Muslims have a far stronger identity with Islam and with being Muslims than other comparable countries on the continent, which is quite surprising. 81% of British Muslims think of themselves as Muslims rather than British. In Germany, it's 66%, and quite surprisingly, given the troubles in France, it's less than half of that in France. Furthermore, whilst 6% of German Muslims and 4% of French Muslims sympathize with Islamic fundamentalists, in Britain, this figure is an alarming 15%. Of these, 4% sympathize directly with terrorists and suicide bombers, and 4% equates to 120,000 people in this country. Now, of course, it's important to note that the majority of young British Muslims hold far more moderate views. They're proud to be British and are well adapted, and that's to be celebrated. But they're not an overwhelming majority, because there is a very sizable minority of British Muslims who hold far more extreme views than even their parents or their grandparents, and that should worry us all. For example, and I find this absolutely amazing, over a third, 36%, of British Muslims aged 16 to 24 believe a Muslim should be put to death if they leave the faith. A majority also believe that homosexuality should be illegal, compared to only 5% in the general public. Now, should we be concerned about all of this? What does it matter to us in our leafy suburbs? Well, there is a correspondence between extremist views and segregation. Muslims who are segregated are about twice as likely to say they have sympathy for terrorist attacks. Now, Professor Ed Hussein, who was a student of Roger Scruton and a friend of our channel, came onto our show to discuss his book Among the Mosques. And he reported there that these communities lived in a parallel universe, and that many of these areas really were no-go zones for white men. And the mosques that dominate in these communities, and indeed further afield, are extreme radical mosques run by the ultra-Orthodox Deobandis, which is the organization that actually founded and gave birth to the Taliban. Riven with poverty and unemployment, and with no exposure to British culture and values, these communities often act as petri dishes for the cultivation of cultural practices which are abhorrent to our values. Honor killings, forced marriage, acid attacks, female genital mutilation, and so-called grooming gangs are all familiar to us today. But petrified by political correctness and beholden to the ideology of multiculturalism, governments, councils, police, and other public institutions have shown themselves unwilling to face the challenge and unable to admit that, however lofty the ideal, extreme diversity leads to division, sectarianism, and prejudice. From anti-Semitism to homophobia and misogyny, segregated communities are showing diversity's darker side. And you know, watching the BBC, etc., we're often told anti-Semitism is on the rise, homophobia is on the rise, misogyny is on the rise, yet no one ever actually asks why that is the case. It's the greatest elephant in the room. Remarkably, in some of these communities, children believe Britain to be a Muslim nation which is 90% Asian, because that's the world that they see around them. And in the year before the pandemic, 20% of Muslim households hadn't been in a non-Muslim house in the previous year. Now, who remembers Norman Tebbett's cricket test? These are the people he was referring to. These are the citizens who were born and raised in this country, but whose loyalty lies elsewhere. And we should regard it as a catastrophic failure on every level that so many British-born children too often identify with the land of their forebears rather than the land in which they live and call home. David Cameron called out the failure of multiculturalism over a decade ago, but talk is cheap. We're 2 more prime ministers later, and what's been achieved? I would argue nothing. So what incentive is there for a young minority to buy into Britain? What incentive is there to integrate when mass immigration continues unfettered, fueling the very communities in which they live? How can we expect young minorities to believe in Britain and the West when our media, our universities, our cultural institutions denigrate Britain's legacy and the West's achievements? When minority cultures are elevated over British culture, and when our students leave school with almost no knowledge of British history or civic values. In that context, who can blame a young boy for cleaving more to the masculine, well-defined culture of his father? Tackling Britain's segregated communities is among the greatest challenges facing this country in the decades ahead, for those communities are in the grip of an ideology and an identity that is every bit as strong and potent as anything Britain or the West can offer. Integration can prove a challenge even in strong, self-confident societies with small amounts of immigration. But without drastic measures for the UK, with each passing year, the opportunities for successfully integrating such communities into British society will only become more difficult, if not impossible. Despite our undoubted successes, mass immigration and multiculturalism risk hurtling us dangerously towards a future of sectarianism and social unrest. So what are the solutions? Is there any hope for Bradford and Oldham, Or should we give up, abandon our great industrial towns and cities, and slip away to a peaceful corner of Albion? Well, it's a Herculean task, and it would require the sudden emergence of a political party or a statesman of immense courage, fortitude, and resolution. But there are a slate of bold policies that could greatly brighten an otherwise bleak horizon. Conveniently, some of these policies are already in action on the continent. For example, following Angela Merkel's catastrophic Syrian refugee fiasco, Germany now has a system of temporary visa permits for asylum seekers. But for true inspiration, Britain could do worse than look to one of Germany's neighbours, a country that long held a reputation for being one of the world's most tolerant and liberal lands. Denmark. In 1980, approximately 1% of the Danish population was non-Western. Non-Western is the Danish term for ethnic minority. Following the migration crisis of 2015, that soared to 9%. Now, that's still low by UK standards. We don't have the latest census results, but I imagine it's about double that in this country. But the speed and scale of the change in Denmark and the sudden emergence of segregated communities of impoverished migrants prompted much soul-searching by Danish governments and public alike. And I say governments because whilst Denmark's policies are deemed controversial abroad, in Denmark they've been fully embraced by both right and left-wing governments. And this left-wing government has gone further than previous right-wing governments. Last year, for example, Denmark passed legislation enabling it to relocate asylum seekers in Africa. Yes, a year ago, socially democratic Denmark was pursuing exactly the same deal that Britain now has with Rwanda. It stalled a bit, and it was only last week, on the back of the UK's announcement, that Denmark actually announced it's also going to deal with Rwanda. All of this was done by a Danish Prime Minister who was a former trade unionist, an uncomfortable truth that Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner would rather not acknowledge, I imagine. So, having followed Denmark in Africa, can Britain take further inspiration from Denmark's immigration and integration policies? Does Denmark offer a solution to Britain's woes? Well, perhaps yes. For a start, Denmark's been far more successful than the UK at reducing its number of asylum seekers. It did this by enacting a number of strict immigration policies, including a dramatic cut in benefits. There was a 50% cut for all asylum seekers, and their benefit is now called an integration benefit. They also, rather controversially, ran a series of ads in Lebanese newspapers saying, "Don't bother coming over here." And even more strangely, perhaps, in 2017, Denmark passed a law called the Jewellery Law, which saw the state confiscate assets of asylum seekers over the value of £1,000 to look after their care and maintenance. And whilst Denmark did give early refuge to about 30,000 Syrians early on in the war, by 2019 it had decided that it would return Syrian refugees back to the homeland once the conditions were safe, and that process is now underway. To quote one critic of Denmark's policy, "Everything the Danish state has done is about scaring people away from Denmark. The message is, stay in Germany, stay in France, everywhere else is better than here." Yet, despite these dramatic reductions, Denmark's Prime Minister is still not content. Her official stated aim is to reduce the number of asylum seekers to zero. Now, can you imagine a British politician making that claim? The Danish measures, unsurprisingly, have seen the country hauled before the European Court of Human Rights, but the policies have worked. 1,500 people applied for asylum in 2020. 1,500 people applied in 2020, the lowest number since the 1990s. It's a policy which every country in Europe has been looking at but hasn't been brave enough to introduce. But controlling immigration was just the first key stage of Denmark's plan to tackle segregation. Now, it seems obvious to say you need to tackle immigration, but in this country it seems as if we can't grasp the fact that when there's a flood, you need to turn off the tap if you're going to deal with the flood. But with its borders now secure, Denmark's current focus is on eliminating its segregated communities, which it calls ghettos. And it's a unique experiment that hasn't been tried anywhere else in the world, and I'm sure it's been quietly observed in Downing Street. Ghetto is a controversial term in the Anglosphere, I know that, but it's actually an officially designated term by the Danish government. But for the Danes, a ghetto is defined as an area which has a 50% majority ethnic population or non-Western population, in which there's also high crime, unemployment, and high degrees of poverty. Since 2010, all ghettos have been listed on an annual ghetto list. Today there are about 30 of them. But if a ghetto has been on the list for 4 years, then it goes into special measures and is deemed to be a severe ghetto. In 2018, the government presented 22 strategies, all designed to eliminate ghettos by the year 2030. And a key government target here is to ensure that in any neighborhood, non-Western immigrants never amount to more than 30% of the area's population. Again, an astonishing move for a liberal democracy. Of the various strategies for achieving its aims, the most controversial has been the sale, renovation, or even the demolition of social housing in so-called severe ghettos. In other words, the very worst ones that suffer from the highest rates of crime, antisocial behavior, and deprivation. The immigrant populations who've been displaced are offered new properties in the area, but crucially, social housing can only make up a maximum of 40% of homes. The aim is to gentrify the area, to bring in new homes, new infrastructure, new businesses, private renters and private owners, and have a true mix of the population generally. And priority for social housing goes to those who are in employment or education. And if you've got a criminal conviction, well, good luck to you. Criminals can't move into these communities, and if you're convicted of a crime, you'll be evicted, and so will your whole family. Whereas still, if you commit a crime in one of these ghetto areas, your penalty will be doubled automatically. Experts say no other country has tried to relocate their citizens in this way, and it's being dubbed at the moment as the greatest social experiment of the century. The government also expects councils to get involved, and to this end, councils receive a cash bonus for each additional ethnic minority resident who is in full-time employment compared with the previous year, and they've had considerable success getting people into jobs and making them productive members of society. And councils also get cash bonuses for every ethnic minority who takes Danish language classes or enrolls in high school. And as for the police, well, rather than tiptoeing around community relations, the Danish police are required to maintain a very strong and very visible presence within those segregated communities at all times so that people feel safe and criminals feel uncomfortable. This includes stop and search, this includes high-profile raids, and the targeting and removal of troublemakers from the area. Perhaps most important of all are the schemes targeted at children, policies I think we would be wise to follow in this country. Given the importance of the first 3 years of a child's life to their future development, it's compulsory for non-Western immigrant children to attend Danish language daycare for 30 hours per week from the age of 1. And here they can be guaranteed a good start to life and proper development of their cognitive skills. Danish language classes are compulsory throughout a child's development, as are courses promoting Danish history, culture, values, and patriotism. Crucially, no more than 30% of children in daycare or in schools can be from a non-Western immigrant background, again ensuring that they have access to a different lifestyle, to different people. And there you have it. Denmark's success speaks for itself. It's controversial abroad, but Denmark's policies have widespread support from across the left and right spectrum. Can Britain learn from Denmark's example and tailor these policies to our unique situation? Well, I hope so, because our situation is, after all, far more dire than theirs. The policy of uncontrolled mass immigration unleashed on this country by Tony Blair and New Labour was the greatest act of national self-harm in the history of our kingdom. It was a cavalier, back-of-the-envelope policy whose devastating long-term consequences had not been given the slightest serious consideration. And I can't think of a more reckless or a more dangerous decision. That successive Conservative governments have effectively continued this policy is, I think, as scandalous as it is shameful. And it may be that the best course of action is for a new patriotic party/lobby group to be founded, not with any serious intention of getting elected to Parliament, but to hold the Conservatives' feet to the fire and threaten their chances of securing a majority in the future. Such a party might just achieve for immigration what UKIP did for the referendum, what the Brexit Party did for Brexit. So have faith in Britain. If the public and political will are there, solutions can be found. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rafe. Incredibly cogent argument made there. Have some questions. Some people who haven't asked yet. Gentleman here first, and then the gentleman here. So we've got one here.
A couple of points. I'm not sure if there's a question as such, but I just feel they're worth raising. Very interesting speech. First of all, I read recently that in France, their policy of banning the hijab in schools had actually proved very successful for young girls' education. That's led to better outcomes for them. And it's also interesting to note that a sign of what we were talking about, the capture of the institutions, including the Conservative Party, has manifested itself in the Conservative Party in Blackburn choosing a candidate who wears the niqab. It is beyond parody, I feel. But if the Conservative Party is doing this, then one really has to ask whether they're Conservative at all. And perhaps that's a question that's beyond your pay grade.
Hang on for a minute. And the other gentleman right here. Thank you. Two at a time, yeah.
Hi, Rafe. It seems to me that multiculturalism, at least in this country, has led to a situation where we treat our home as though it's a blank slate awaiting inscription by newcomers who bring their cultures with them, at least in some circles. And one of the challenges that I always come across is this notion that there's no such thing as Britishness. You know, what is Britishness anyway? It's just a diverse and tolerant nation of multicultural areas. Is there a robust response that you could offer as a response to that challenge?
Yes, well, you remind me. Well, first I'll go to your point. And it's true. I mean, we have a Tory Party in name only, Taino. It's, you know, I can't tell you how hopeful I was in 2019. I never trusted Boris Johnson for a moment. I always knew he was a wishy-washy liberal, but he had behind him a Machiavellian master of the dark arts in the shape of Dominic Cummings, who actually knew the lay of the land, and he understood what needed to be done. And what they always say, expect the unexpected. COVID arrived, right? And if it wasn't for COVID, we wouldn't have had all of the tumult that we've had with regards to a team who weren't capable of dealing with that situation. And because of Carrie Antoinette, we all know that Dominic was shown the door. And ever since then, he's been a puppet hanging on a string with no one there to pull the strings. And any semblance you had, any hope you had that this would be a man who could have had at least a 10-year time in office to really try to reverse that long march through the institutions. That was a golden chance we had. From 2010 to 2019, absolutely nothing was done by Cameron, by Blair Light. But suddenly we had this chance. And we were all told, Stephen Davis at the IEA said this is the great restructuring of the political system. It's no longer going to be about economics, it's going to be cultural values. The Lib Dems and the UKIP are the far right and the far left now, and everyone else is in the centre. We were all looking forward to really seeing the civil service being reformed, the BBC, and it's all been jettisoned and frittered away. And I think that is the greatest sadness and greatest disaster of our times, because the Tory Party is getting much older. If people who voted in the last election have been limited to those who are under 25, with the Corbyn election, he would have had a 100-seat majority. That's the sad reality. And the Tory Party isn't taking into account the fact that they have an aging demographic, and the demographic coming up below because of the teacher training colleges who come through with this sort of Marxist left-leaning agenda, brainwashing children. The old adage, give me a boy from the age of 7 till he's 7 and I'll show you the man. Well, now it's give me a boy till he's 21 and left university and I'll show you a fully functioning, brainwashed individual. So yes, it's a desperate time in terms of finding somewhere that you can say, as a high Tory like I am, or if you're a proper conservative, this is my home now. And we feel homeless. In terms of Britishness, yes, I'm reminded of Robin Cook in 2001, the former sometime Foreign Secretary, who said, there's no such thing as Britishness. Britain has always been a country of a multiracial country. No one was indigenous to these isles. For the last 1,000 years, 1% of the British population was born abroad. Now it's now 19% or so. There's a lot to be proud for by being British, as well as by being English. The thing is, a lot of the great values that we think of as being British are actually woven into the national fabric, but originally are of English origin, and it's time also to reclaim those on days like St. George's Day. Britishness I've always loved, though, because after the Roman Empire, really, it was the next great transnational identity. It wasn't really a racial identity in the same way that being English or Scots was. You could be in Christchurch, you could be in Sydney or Cape Town or Vancouver or Glasgow, and you're all equally British under the crown. And into that, you got woven ideas and values rather than ethnic nationality. And I think it's so beautiful what Britain created, and it's something we've exported to the world. And I think it's something we can take pride in, but it's not tangible. And when something isn't tangible, when you're dealing with philosophy and ideas and concepts and parliamentary democracy, it's difficult to take pride in those if you can't see them or hold on to them.
Yes.
Thanks, Rafe. Yeah, I'm Ben Greening. I'm the director of Migration Watch UK. Thanks for the excellent presentation. I just wanted to point to the excellent report that was done in 2015, 2016 by now Baroness Louise Casey, which was a meticulously documented study which took months of investigation up and down the country, which revealed a huge amount of division and segregation and retrograde reality of divided communities, which unfortunately the government then either watered down the very clear recommendations that came out of it, or they ignored them completely. I just wanted to ask, is that not a searing indictment of the governments that we've had in place since 2015, 2016, when the report was done, that those recommendations were essentially ignored or squelched? And do we not need another Casey report to highlight the situation as it stands now? Just want to say we have a stall outside Migration Watch UK where we've been around 20 years and been looking at this issue in depth. So if you have any questions, feel free to come and ask during the lunch break. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. Do you want to answer that?
Yes, Migration Watch, and Alp Mehmet is here in the front row. Migration Watch is an absolutely stellar organisation, one of the few organisations I trust for statistics and research. And yes, Dame Casey's report was a stellar piece of work, but you knew when it was published that it would never be followed up on by the government. It was simply too radical. It was exposing too many real wounds, which the government would rather have plastered over, not to be seen by anybody. But remember, this is a Tory government, which since 2010 and in every election since then has pledged in its party manifesto to reduce immigration to the tens of thousands. And every government has gone without achieving that by any stretch. In fact, it keeps going up. And yet every 4 or 5 years, they represent the same manifesto with the same party pledge in it. And again, the people vote for it for some reason. And again, it's not delivered upon until the last time when they decided that they'll just stop lying altogether and just say they're going to aim and have an ambition to lower it. So it's a very sorry state of affairs.
That was a very helpful information you put there. I just wanted your thoughts with regards to the chart you showed about the upward curve of immigration since pretty much the Second World War. What are your thoughts on the end game of immigration? Because there must be a reason why there's been a significant upward trend in immigration since 2000. I can understand immigration after the war, obviously, post-war immigration. But I'd be interested in your thoughts on what is the end game of both political parties here, because they both seem to be very interested in more immigration, more immigration, more immigration. So I would be interested in your thoughts on the agenda behind all of that.
Well, it's almost like a giant Ponzi scheme, isn't it? Where you have to keep flooding the institution every year. You've got to get more and more in to keep the entire thing afloat. But of course, you get to a saturation point, and we long ago passed it. I mean, to put it into some context, everybody talks about the Ugandan refugees. A great moment when we took in, when they were fleeing Idi Amin, we took in 27,000 immigrants, and that, of course, was a huge number by the standards of the day. Everybody was alarmed by it. That comes in now every 2 weeks into our country. The equivalent of the Ugandan refugees is every 2 weeks. We've had more immigration to this country in the last 25 years than in the last 2,000 years combined. So whenever people tell you Britain's always been a nation of immigrants, no. Under the Romans, there were 3% of the country was born abroad. Under the Normans and the Vikings, it was about 5%. But then for the next 1,000 years, it was around 0.5. In 1851, it was 0.5%. Then it was 1.5. In 1951, it was 4%. 2001, 8%. Then it's gone up to 14, 15%. Who knows what the latest census is going to say, which should be out this month or next month. And you're going to see a great shock there. Because no society can sustain such rapid change. Any civilized society needs to absorb immigrants. Immigrants are very valuable. I'm a child of immigrants. I value immigration hugely, but it has to be done at a speed that it can be assimilated at in. Because even people who came here in the 60s and 70s had problems assimilating when they were in such small numbers. I fail to see how it's going to pan out. But what happens is you get a backlash, you get resentment. That's why you're seeing rise in racial tensions from the indigenous population of this country, because they see changes that are happening too fast.
Thank you very much, Rafe. Thank you very much indeed.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.